Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, business, education, whatever gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass at CompassKnox.com, which covers all of the above and more. Joined, as always, by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing on this sort of chilly and rainy Friday, Scott?
I'm doing okay for it being a chilly and rainy Friday. Have just about recovered from the city election, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Mm-hmm. And so looking forward to the weekend. So that's nice.
Yeah. Well, let's get to it. It has been sort of a busy week here in November. It is election time. Even though it's an off year, we did have some pretty interesting city elections. So we are going to talk all about those. Also on our program today, we're going to be talking about a couple of interesting events at the school board, including an appearance by our newly revitalized chapter of Moms for Liberty, the conservative activist group. There is an interesting antisemitism complaint at the University of Tennessee. UT is investigating whether a professor may have stepped across some bounds. Knox County Commission had a fascinating, though not necessarily heartening, meeting with some of its state legislators to talk about the upcoming session. But before we talk about all those things, Scott, yes, the city elections. On the one hand, I guess not huge surprises maybe in who won, although some of those margins were pretty interesting and there were some other interesting wrinkles. Let's get into it. What happened?
Well, it was a bunch of blowouts. Mm-hmm. It was landslides, whatever you want to call them. And you're right. I think a lot of people, the people who won were kind of, I think most people kind of handicapping the races would have said yes, they're the ones who are going to win. But like you said, the margins were pretty significant. We had on the ballot. We had 5 races on the ballot. 2 city council races were uncontested. So Lynn Fugit and Charlie Thomas are reelected, and without opposition. So that's so we're going to ignore them the rest of the time. Right. So
congratulations to them.
Congratulations,
well
yes. But we had 2 city council races and the municipal judge race. Both of these are at-large seats on city council. First, we'll dispense with Debbie Helsley's victory over R. Bentley Marlowe first, because it was probably the most expected outcome. They squared off in the primary, just one-on-one in the primary. There were no other candidates, so that was kind of a preview of what to expect in the general election. And Helsley got more than 69% of the vote, almost 70% of the vote in the primary. So Marlowe had a lot of ground to make up, and did not make up any. In fact, regressed a little bit. Helsley won in the general election with 71% of the vote. So there was no moving of the needle there. Marlowe ran a campaign that was essentially a single issue campaign, and that was housing. He's a developer. He has redeveloped houses in the Mechanicsville neighborhood. He's been very busy doing that, and that's what his primary focus was. Helsley was kind of more of a broad general campaigner. She was a union officer a long time and was a union president before she retired, and an officer in the Democratic Party, and she kind of just cruised after the primary to victory there.
Well, and that is one of the interesting things about these at-large seats, where no matter what happens in the primary, they still go on to the general. And we've had this happen before, where there's only two people running, and you kind of end up running the literal same election twice. It's kind of a weird system. There's been discussion before about maybe changing it so that it would be more like the mayor's race, where if anybody gets over 50% in the primary, they can just win outright. But we don't have that system, and so this really was just sort of like a repeat.
Yeah, it was pretty much a carbon copy, and you go through precinct by precinct, the exact same numbers show up. I mean, it was pretty uncanny. That's one thing is, and we can get to turnout in just a bit. The turnout was almost as high in the general election as it was in the primary. Of course, in the primary, we had the mayor's race on the ballot. The mayor, Indy Kincannon, won. Got more than half the vote in the primary, so she didn't have to run in the general election. So, despite that, it was still pretty close as far as turnout goes. So you could really make a good comparison between the primary and the general election as you look at voters, at the results. And one of the things that helps with that is city voters tend to be the quote unquote super voters who vote every election no matter what. And so the same people tend to vote in primary and the general. You really don't add too many or subtract too many people from that. Anyway, and one thing that will come up as a recurring theme throughout this is the candidates who were more identified with the either the Democratic Party or the more progressive movement of the in the city prevailed, and the ones who were perceived as more conservative lost.
Right, and Marlowe had actually identified himself as a Democrat on his initial campaign filing, even though you don't have to claim a party affiliation in the city. But Helsley obviously had very strong Democratic Party credentials, and then Marlowe was also dogged by these prior social media posts he had made about homeless people, which expressed fairly aggressive, even contemptuous attitudes toward homeless people that definitely put him, I don't think he identified as any kind of conservative exactly, but it didn't match the sort of liberal progressive view of the homeless population, let's say. No,
and he had to spend an inordinate amount of time fighting against that. It was brought up. In fact, there was one forum that was sponsored by SOCM and the and some other organizations about homelessness specifically. Marlowe did show up and was pretty much beaten down through the whole thing, although to give the guy credit, he knew what was coming and did show up, and that was, it took his lumps, and basically tried to say that my social media posts weren't truly reflective of the kind of guy I am, and that
part of the problem was the posts were only like 2 or 3 years ago. It's not like something he wrote when he was 17.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm not excusing. Some of the things he wrote were pretty. He was talking about euthanizing people who are homeless and things like that. I mean, it was pretty bad. And he didn't disavow them. He just said that he was exaggerating and angry and tried to. But he's had to spend a lot of time doing that rather than And of course, that's a self-inflicted wound. I'm not saying that it was unfair. I'm just saying that he did have to spend a lot of time addressing that rather than issues, housing or any other issues. But he really didn't. He really tried to focus all of his efforts on addressing the housing shortage, and that was, he's basically a one-issue candidate.
Well, one thing, there's a lot of talk these days about making sure young people understand that anything you put on social media could come back to haunt you in the future. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. But this was definitely an illustration that applies to people who might be thinking about running for office too.
Yes.
If you have it anywhere in your head that you might be running for office somewhere down the line and you feel tempted to go and rant on a social media platform, just be aware that somebody out there is probably going to come and find that eventually.
Oh, yeah. That will happen, and you'll have to be prepared for that if you, depending on one of the reasons I really don't post a whole lot on social media. Not that I'm going to run for office, but
right. I post a lot on social media, but I'm definitely not going to run for office.
Yeah. I'm not going to run for office either. But even if I, even so, I still don't post a whole lot on social media.
Hey, that's the same reason I don't donate to campaigns. If I ever have any desire to run for office in the future, I don't want that record out there.
That's
so
right.
The less there is to know, I guess, the better.
Yeah, keep the people in the dark. Yeah, that's a good. That's a really good platform.
Thinking
there,
like
Seth.
a politician already, Seth.
So, the other two races that were on the ballot were really fascinating. Even though they ended up being blowouts, they were fascinating. One was the at-large seat C race for city council. Amelia Parker was the incumbent. She is a product basically of the city council movement, which is a very progressive grassroots organization. She was the first African American to be elected to a citywide office in the city of Knoxville 4 years ago. She's also been a very outspoken critic, I think you could say, of Mayor India Kincannon's administration. She, I think it's been pretty rocky, her relationship with other city council members for various reasons, and so I think she, could have been seen as somewhat vulnerable in fact and they had a three-way primary with Parker, Tim Hill, who's a developer and the chair of the Knox County Planning Commission, and Matthew Best, who is the head of the Change Center in East Knoxville. And Best was kind of put up, I think, basically as an alternative to Parker for people who lean left a little bit.
Right, sort of like liberals uncomfortable with Parker.
Right, yeah. I think a lot of the, I think you could say mainstream liberals or whatever have misgivings about her. Part of it because she is so, puts a critical eye on the Kincannon administration, and but basically, I think he was seen as an alternative to Parker. And he has a pretty strong showing in the general election. He got 22% of the vote. I'm sorry, in the primary, he got 22% of the vote in the primary. So, and in the primary, Parker only had a 4-point. She finished first by 4 percentage points over Hill, so it was very close. And those 22% of the vote that Best got, that was on the table. That could have gone to either candidate. In what ended up happening, and it was and this repeated itself over and over, they all went to Parker. I mean, this was one of those things where you looked at the overall numbers, and Hill did not improve at all between the primary and the general election. And then you go through precinct by precinct throughout the city. The city has, essentially 49 precincts. They've got 52 technically, but 3 of them don't even have people who live in them. They're very small, and for technical
They're
reasons.
just on the map.
They're on the map, yeah. For technical reasons, they were like holes in the map that they had to designate as a precinct. So anyway, but there are 49 precincts, and you go through precinct by precinct and look at the results, and Hill's numbers were almost exactly the same in every precinct. It wasn't that
between the primary and the
between
general.
the primary and the general. It wasn't like in the general election. He did, for example, he did much more strongly in West Knoxville in the primary than he did in other areas, and he did very well, and he didn't improve in those areas. Parker got all of the votes in those areas. In fact, flipped a bunch of the precincts from Hill to her in the general election, and it was just now there are various reasons you could come up with. I think one of the factors is that kind of partisan divide, an advantage that liberal and progressive candidates have inside the city of Knoxville. Hill was he's donated to both candidates in both parties, but he got an endorsement, unsolicited, he says, but he was an endorsement nonetheless from the Knox County Republican Party, and then he kind of in the kind of political wonky circles, there was a lot of backlash, I think, because he hosted a fundraiser for Republican presidential candidate Ron DeSantis, and so the perception was that he would be a very much a Republican. If as Republicans go, he always tried to say that, okay, I'm going to look at local issues, not national issues here. And I've covered the Planning Commission, and he's always done things, like I said, try to convince other developers to talk to the neighborhoods and get neighborhood buy-in before they do things. Now, things that a lot of people think are good government anyway, but nonetheless, that perception of his being a Republican and would try to, I don't know if he would try to, the thought would be that he would try to promote developers' interests over anyone else's interests and things like that. So he just was not able to gain any traction. If that could have been a big factor there, and I think it probably was.
Well, and I think it's really interesting to look at this race because Tim Hill, I think, is exactly the kind of person who routinely got elected to city council, say 20, 25 years ago. Sort of a moderate Republican white man.
Yeah.
Because that also used to be the norm on city council. And, sort of a good government, Chamber of Commerce, Leadership Knoxville type guy. That was the sort of Knoxville ruling political class just a generation ago. But the city has trended more and more progressive, as you're saying. And, somebody asked me the other day, looking at Parker's numbers, because Parker is not just sort of liberal progressive or center left like, say, Kincannon is. She's a real progressive. She's a leftist. People talk about leftists, and there's a tendency to kind of call anything leftist. But I think Parker is reasonable. You can reasonably call her, yeah, she's a leftist of one stripe or another. A leftist black woman was not the model city council candidate a generation ago. And so somebody said to me, well, do you think this means like a 60% of the Knoxville voting population really as far left as Parker? And I said, I probably not, because the same population also elected Kincannon by almost the same measure. But when you reduce it to this binary choice between a more progressive candidate and a candidate who's seen as being more conservative, that is where a lot of the default in the city is going to go now. And I think it's just something that people need to get their heads around. I think there are some people who still have some outdated ideas about Knoxville's political identity and personality. And, okay, maybe not the whole city is Amelia Parker, because all of city council is not Amelia Parker. And, Mayor Kincannon, again, is often at odds with Parker. But it's a pretty blue city. It's a pretty progressive city. And if you make people choose between just sort of like a progressive candidate and a conservative candidate, at least right now, it doesn't look like that comes out in the favor of the conservative candidate.
No, and you mentioned things a generation ago. Yeah, there were basically used to be two paths to city council. One was that business community, chamber of commerce, serve on boards kind of path, and the other would be through neighborhood organizations where people would they would volunteer with their neighborhood organization, then they'd become president of the neighborhood association, then they work with other neighborhoods, and then and go on and then eventually run for office, usually for a district seat, but they would run and move on. And in recent years, it's been more of and I think Parker is an example of somebody who's come up as an activist. I mean, she's been politically active, but she has, from the activist standpoint, and that's a new pathway, or not new necessarily, but a newfound strength to that kind of pathway. So and really, you can go back 4 years ago to her first election, or first victory, when she defeated Amy Midas for this seat. And Amy Midas was very much the neighborhood,
right, West Knoxville Neighborhood Association.
She neighborhood association president. I think she was with the neighborhood council, which is the citywide association of neighborhood organizations. Very much involved and active, and she was running against Parker, who was, as I said, from the activist kind of community, or as from the activist role, and Parker won. Mm-hmm. And Midas had, she raised more money and probably had a broader network of people that she knew. But Parker won, and repeated it again, because when
speaking of money,
Tim Hill spent close to $250,000. It was $35 a vote. He really even if he had won, that still would have been a bit of an eye-popping amount for a city council race. But to spend that much money, outspend your opponent by a 4-to-1 margin, because Parker had raised less than $50,000, and lose by almost 20 points, that tells you something. Yeah, it does. And one of the things that it tells you is that you need more than money to win. There has to be you don't buy a seat in Knoxville, apparently. So,
and I think the other thing,
not that I think that was the only thing he had going for him. I mean, as we said, he had the resume going for him. He had he had money going for him. Obviously a large network of people that he knew throughout the city. He had all those things going for him, Parker does have a very passionate core group of supporters, and then you get to the more partisan divide. And I talked to people who, and I'm sure you did too, who said, "Boy, if anybody but Hill was running against Parker, I'd vote for him." Mm-hmm. They just really didn't, and
they couldn't quite get there with somebody who had hosted a Ron DeSantis fundraiser and so forth.
So
and I think the other thing that we do absolutely have to give credit to here is not just the demographic shifts and everything else, but running campaigns is hard. Winning campaigns is even harder. There's been a lot of criticism and questions about Parker's actual service on city council and how effective she's been and so forth. And that was some of what the people running against her this year were talking about. But she has now won back-to-back races where even running as an incumbent this year, which would normally make you a favorite, she still looked like, if not an underdog, at least vulnerable because of all the things you talked about. And she won. She didn't just win. She trounced him. Like, she's a good politician. Amelia Parker is very good at running for office and winning office, and anybody who doesn't see that at this point is just like denying the obvious.
Oh yeah, absolutely. She is, she, especially with her core supports, she really speaks to them. I mean, one of the things is if you go to a city council meeting, or you can get a little bit of it. I think if you watch, her supporters will go to city council meetings. They actually will cheer and do things like that here when she's, and clap when she talks about things to an extent that other, other city council members don't have. And so it's, she's a very good, politician in it. Anybody who I think that it's fair to say that she could have been seen as vulnerable, but anybody who thought that she was doomed was obviously wrong about her. So yeah, in fact, she, even before she won 4 years ago, 2 years before that, she ran it for the was it the fourth district seat, and finished second in the primary in a tie, and could have, she was council selected the other person who finished second,
Harry Tyndall,
to go on to the general election. She mounted a write-in campaign and got 20% of the vote.
Right, which is very hard to do. I mean, that was a very impressive showing for such a grassroots candidate at that point.
That was an amazing showing.
Yep.
So yeah, she's pretty formidable as a campaigner.
And I don't want to start talking about the 2027 mayoral race, but I will say that a candidate who has won by significant margins back-to-back citywide contests for city council, it would not be hard for that candidate to then think about running for mayor.
Oh, there's already been whispers about it. So, but we'll see. Like I said, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. That's 4 years from now. And we can move on now to the judges race, the municipal judges race, and we're going to sound like a broken record, because the dynamic here was very similar to the Hill and Parker race. We had John Rawson, who who's been judge for 37 years. Though he's not really that experienced a campaigner, he won. He's only been in a campaign 2 previous times. The first time he was elected, he was appointed in 1986. Ran essentially as an incumbent in 87 and won in the primary. And then had a primary challenge in 2003 and won in the primary there. So for the past 20 years, he hasn't even had a primary challenger, much less a general election to win. And he was running as Tyler Cavanis, who, he's been a judge longer than Cavanis has been alive. Mm-hmm. Cavanis is very young, very energetic, and this was a campaign essentially between, experience versus new blood. That was the theme, and it was embraced by both of them. I mean, Rawson ran on his experience, and that was his main selling point. And Cavanis, tried to make sure, so this isn't about his job performance. This is about having some. He's been in there long enough. We need fresh ideas, and I can bring that sort of thing. And again, there was a 4-way primary this year for municipal judge, and Rawson won, but it was only by 1.5 points. I mean, Cavanis was very close behind him.
And if he'd gotten over 50%, well, if anybody had, but if Rawson had managed to get more than 50% of the vote in the primary, he would have won outright.
He would have won outright. So now the other two candidates, Mary Ward and Andrew Beamer, they got about a quarter of the vote, so like 26%, and so Rawson got them to endorse him, and after the primary ended, and they did, and so you're kind of thinking, well, he's going to get some of their supporters because they endorsed him. Cavanis would point out at the time, though, said, well, wait a minute. 62% of the people who voted for him and the people who voted for Beamer and Ward added up to about 62%. 62% of the people wanted change. And, and they still want change. And I'm going to win. And lo and behold, he got 62% of the vote in the primary. He was spot on that one. And again, it was there was a partisan perception there. Cavanis got a lot of support from Democrats. He also got some support from Republicans. He never came out and said, "Okay, I'm a Democrat" or anything like that. But he did get, Democrats gravitated toward him.
He didn't discourage the perception that he was maybe a little more progressive minded than Rawson. Yeah.
Well, just by being young and fresh ideas, that's progressive. So Rawson, on the other hand. Now Rawson is kind of an interesting guy because he goes to every, despite the fact that he hadn't had a competitive race in 20 years, he'd go to almost every political event you can imagine, Democratic events, Republican events. He went to them all. But during the primary, after the primary, the Republican Party endorsed him. And so there's all of a sudden he's in the Republican camp. And then there was a photo of him. We've talked about this before, a photo of him with former President Donald Trump when Trump was campaigning in 2015. He was in Knoxville. Rawson went and introduced the person who said the Pledge of Allegiance in this prayer and sang the Star Spangled Banner and then left. But he had a picture taken of him with Trump. Now, Rawson gets pictures taken with everybody. When John F. Kennedy or Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was in Knoxville a few weeks ago, he went to the rally and got a picture taken with him. But this one was the one that really got circulated around. And then toward the end of the election, he started using that photo in campaign mailers. Kind of doubling down.
He had this weird relationship to that photo. On the one hand, saying it doesn't mean I'm a Republican, but then he had two separate flyers, one aimed at Democrats and one aimed at Republicans. But the one aimed at Republicans had that picture on him, and noted that he also was endorsed by the Knox County Republican Party, and that did him about as much good as it did Tim Hill.
Yeah, it did, and again, Cavanis got close to 62% of the vote. Like the Hill and Parker race, you could go through precinct by precinct. It's pretty much similar outcomes in the primary and in the general. One of the interesting things about this, the partisan dynamic that we talked about that was a little bit weird to fit, is Rawson actually won some precincts in 3 precincts in East Knoxville, one in the Lonsdale precinct, which are heavily Democratic, and he won those in the general election too. And of course, one of the problems is those are also districts or precincts where very few people vote. Mm-hmm. So I mean, winning those by even if you win by a large margin doesn't really help you a whole lot on the overall vote citywide. So he had that. He also did well in Norwood, which is probably the most conservative area of the city of Knoxville. So that was kind of a weird thing, but by and large, but he also did well in the primaries in those districts. Again, it was one of those things where Rawson did not improve. In fact, he got a few votes fewer in the general. Of course, there were fewer people who voted. The turnout was almost, but not quite as big as it was in the primary. But again, in precinct after precinct, and of course in the overall count, Cavanis got all of the votes that did not go to Rawson in the primary, just like Parker got all the votes that didn't go to Hill from that primary.
Yep. Well, and I think there are a lot of things you can draw from it, but the biggest one, I think, just comes back to that fundamental political identity of the city of Knoxville right now. Is it's a pretty progressive place.
Yeah.
And if you are running for a citywide office, now if we see this change to the district races because of the state law that was passed, which we've talked about, where those races are only conducted within the districts, there are a couple of districts where that may lean more Republican, where that might be, it might be easier for a Republican candidate, more conservative candidate to get elected in a couple of districts. But if you're running citywide in Knoxville right now, just like if you're running countywide in Knox County, in the city, it helps to be more progressive. If you're running countywide, it helps to be more conservative. And those are just the political identities of our two local bodies right now. Yeah,
and in the city, it's really apparent in the city because at least now, up through this election, this is probably, we can talk about this in a minute, but it's probably going to change 4 years from now or 2 years from now. But the general elections are citywide for all seats, not just the at-large seats. So you essentially have the exact same electorate voting for every single city council seat, the same pool of voters, every single city council seat. And just like in the 1990s, that meant that just about all of the city council members were more establishment, moderate Republican types. Now it means that they're more progressive. And in fact, as a result of this, Debbie Helsley was running for at-large seat B, which is currently held by Janet Testerman. Testerman decided not to run for re-election. Testerman's a Republican. She ran for the state legislature as a Republican. Her family's been she's been a Republican since the cradle. So and she's leaving council, and Helsley, who's essentially been a Democrat since the cradle, is taking her place. So really, it just adds to that kind of bluish, not bluish, but a blue tint of city government. And in fact, it's going to mean that the most conservative member now on council would probably be Lynn Fugit, who
has somewhat pushed back against the idea that she is conservative per se,
or Republican for sure.
Although she was also endorsed by the Republican Party, even though she didn't have an opponent.
But Fugit is also responsible for probably the most progressive piece of legislation that passed in the last 4 years, and that was establishing the affordable rental or the affordable housing fund, and establishing by law that the city had to spend at least $5 million a year from city tax revenues on affordable housing. The other more progressive candidates didn't get that. Didn't get that done. She did, and so. They all voted for it, don't get me wrong, but she was the driving force behind it, and she's considered the most conservative member of council now. So,
right. Yep. That's where we are. Well, and the other thing to just mention is that because of swapping in Debbie Helsley for Janet Testerman, basically it maintains the current gender balance on council. It would be 6 women and 3 men continued. So we continue to have the historically unprecedented situation of having female majorities on all of our local elected bodies, council, county commission, and school board.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's move on to a couple of other things. We did want to go into those city elections in detail because that's what we do. That's our bread and butter.
And guess what? Our listeners probably don't have to hear us talk about these city elections for a very long time after this because it's done.
But they're going to get to hear us talk about other elections.
Very,
yeah,
well,
soon.
Yeah. But
not,
names.
But not this week. We're not going to talk about other elections this week. Maybe next week. All right. County Commission had an interesting meeting. This was a week ago, and we wrote about this past week with members of the state legislature, our local legislative delegation. This is something that most of our local bodies do every year ahead of the legislative session. City council often does it, and the school board as well, where they sit down with our local representatives to the state legislature and just kind of outline their priorities for the coming session. And what was interesting to me about this meeting was that you had the Republican-dominated county commission. County commission is as Republican-dominated as city council is progressive-dominated. Talking to a Republican-dominated legislative delegation. 5 of our 7 state legislators are Republicans, and all of our state senators are Republicans. And yet, even though you have Republicans talking to Republicans saying, hey, fellow Republicans, here's the things we would like you to do for us in Nashville this year, the response to most of them was, yeah, that's going to be hard. And it really was a good illustration of, the way certain kinds of entrenched interests play out in our state government of many different kinds. And so on the one hand, Commission is seeking a couple of changes that are opposed by primarily not by conservative groups, but by media groups. This was one of those meetings where you're there. I was there as a reporter along with the News Sentinel reporter, and we got a lot of glances and a lot of people kind of talking directly at us because the things that County Commission was asking to do, one of them was to change their legal notices, which they have to, when they're having any kind of public meeting, their state law, it says you have to provide adequate public notification. And right now in state law, adequate public notification means it has to be printed in a newspaper of general circulation. And the county has already moved to posting all of those things online also, but they still put them in newspapers because of a change they made to how they allocate that a few years ago. Most of that money now goes to Republican newspaper publisher Steve Hunley. The Knoxville Focus gets, I forget, it's somewhere 70 to 80% of the total revenue, the total spend that the county makes right now goes to Steve Hunley. But what the county is asking is basically, saying this is an antiquated law. Most people don't read print newspapers anymore. Even if they do read newspapers, it's mostly online. And I should say that Compass, because we are an online-only publication, we're not eligible for any of these. We don't have a fiscal dog in this fight. We get no money from any of these kinds of ads. But State Senator Richard Briggs, State Rep. Elaine Davis, in talking about this issue, basically told County Commission, the problem is the newspapers. The newspaper publishers don't want to let you stop running these things in newspapers because it's money for them. And so for like the Knoxville Focus, it's close to $90,000 in the last fiscal year. And in a lot of smaller counties that maybe have, like a local weekly in some cases, those notices can be a significant amount of their actual total revenue, especially because other kinds of advertising revenue have gone online in, the last couple of decades. And so even though the county was only asking for a private act, which basically means can you pass a law that just lets Knox County do this if we want, the message was kind of like, well, we'll try, but the newspapers don't like it. It's probably not going to happen. Similar response to an effort to allow county commissioners, like one commissioner per meeting if they have to be out of town, if they're sick or whatever, to participate in meetings virtually, electronically, because the argument is that, well, we all learned how to do this during the pandemic. I mean, there was a year or so there where most county commission meetings were online, but that was through exceptions under the, state of emergency that had been declared then. And, interestingly, the school board is allowed to do this. There's state law that lets up to one school board member a few times a year participate remotely, and I've been at Knox County School Board meetings where that happens, and it works okay. We all know what Zoom is like. It's better to have somebody there in person, but they can actually participate virtually. But again, us media representatives in the room got some dark looks from people because they said, well, again, it's the media that doesn't want this. Tennessee Coalition for Open Government has a lot of concerns about allowing virtual participation, that it reduces accountability and transparency and people's access to their government if you have too many people participating virtually rather than showing up. And so once again, the answer there was, we'll try, but probably not. One of the most interesting things that Commission is asking for, and this is the second year that they've really pushed for this, has been just permission to charge what they call adequate facilities fees, more often called impact fees. And these would basically be fees on new development. That if you as a developer are going to come in and build a subdivision in some, undeveloped part of the county, you're converting agricultural land, that you could be assessed a per square foot fee depending on the size of the development, and that fee would go specifically to pay for new infrastructure to help support that growth. Because this is something the county's been talking about a lot in recent years, not made a lot of headway in figuring out how to address. But, when you have new growth, then you have to have infrastructure that can support it, because if you don't, then you get into bad traffic situations, you get into overcrowded schools and all of those things. And this is something that other counties in the state, a few other counties in the state actually have the ability to do this because that was passed as private acts for them. Then the state came in and passed laws saying basically you can't do this. And the ones that exist have been grandfathered in. So there's a handful of counties that still do this, but nobody else is allowed to do that. And the county commission is just asking, can we have permission to do this? They're not even saying for sure they would do it, but we would like to have this as a possibility. And Briggs kind of threw cold water on that too. And he said, well, when this has been raised recently, the people who you would expect to oppose it have opposed it, and that's home builders and developers. They don't want anything that's going to increase their costs and or the cost they have to pass along to their then buyers or customers. And then on top of that, of course, we do have a housing crunch here. We have much concern about rising housing prices. And so anything that could increase the cost of new housing for the consumer is going to, be an uphill battle. And so Briggs just kind of said, again, it may be a nice idea, but it's going to be hard to get much traction for it right now. And of course, the other thing Briggs said to Commission was that the first thing you're going to hear in Nashville when you go and talk about this is they're going to say, well, if you need more money, why don't you just do it the old-fashioned way and raise property taxes?
Yeah.
And when was the last time you raised property taxes, by the way, as Briggs said? And the answer to that is going to be 1999. And so it's a little hard for the county to go and kind of pour mouth to the state when the obvious response is, if we have a very straightforward mechanism for you to increase your revenues that you're just choosing not to do for political reasons or whatever. Don't come and ask us to solve your problem for you. So, and there were a few other things too, but it was just interesting kind of showing you even in cases where the local legislators were saying, yes, we will carry that bill for you. But we don't think it's going to get
don't expect
far.
much.
Right, exactly. And it just, the one other thing that I thought was interesting was one of the things they asked for, which the school board has also asked for, is some guarantee that the state is going to continue to put new money into this new student funding formula that they've come up with to fund public education in the state. Because Knox County Schools got a big jump. All school systems across the state got a big jump in the first year of this past year. But there's a lot of concern that jump is not only going to, we're not going to keep getting big jumps every year, but that actually over the near future, the increases in that funding might not even keep pace with inflation, and the impact of that could be eroded pretty quickly. And Briggs on that one said, well, let me tell you, what I'm hearing is that Governor Lee's priority in this coming session is not going to be on funding public schools per se at all. It's going to be on expanding the state voucher program. And so that was just a little preview of something I think we're going to be talking a lot about in the next 5 or 6 months is school vouchers, because that battle is gearing up and getting ready to happen.
Well, plus all last week, the legislature was meeting to talk about rejecting federal education funding, which would, I would think, throw the new funding formula with state money completely into disarray, because the state would have to make up for that $2 billion if that ever happens.
Yeah, lots of interesting conversation there, and we'll be actually writing about those issues in the coming weeks. But for now, Scott, let's also talk about this interesting complaint that's been filed at the University of Tennessee by a student alleging anti-Semitic statements by a professor.
Yeah, we first reported this a couple of weeks ago, and the new development last week was that the university said that, yes, we are indeed, there is a formal investigation. There was a formal complaint filed. Initially, it was kind of an informal complaint, and they said, well, we're looking into it. Now it's a formal complaint. The UT has an investigations and compliance office. They are going to be investigating this. And what the situation where it stems from is there was a class, and we're doing our best not to kind of identify it too heavily, because actually UT hasn't officially to us.
You have, I should say.
Yeah, there's a lot I've got that hasn't been confirmed, or some of it that has been confirmed but not officially from UT.
Right. Basically, we know who this professor is.
We know who the professor is.
But there's concerns that there could be threats against them and other things if their name's released. And right now, it's just under investigation. We're not naming that person
at this point. So we could name this person in the future, but in fact, we had the name before, but because there wasn't even a complaint filed, there wasn't even a question of reporting that. We don't, responsible journalists don't report that a particular person is could be under investigation. You got to wait till they actually are. But anyway, what happens was there was a class, and this professor was, and this was in the syllabus. This was what they were already going to be talking about, and it's called settler colonialism, and this is in the context of the Israeli-Hamas conflict going on right now in Gaza. But they were going to be talking about settler colonialism. Now, settler colonialism is kind of a form of colonialism. Obviously, traditionally, colonialism is where think of India and British rule in India, or French rule in Indochina, when those were colonies, where the population stayed intact, and the European colonial power just went in and ran things.
Took over the country.
But didn't, the population stayed. They were oppressed and they were taken advantage of, but they remained. Settler colonialism is where a power comes, and power comes in and replaces the population and the culture that was there, and establishes a new one.
Sort of like the United States.
Kind of like the United States. Yes. The United States, where we had the cause and the indigenous population of Native Americans who were completely replaced by Eurocentric culture, and this professor apparently in this lecture was talking about Israel and their policies toward land use in Israel, and toward the Palestinians in Israel doing the exact same thing, and made comparisons to the actions of the Israeli government to Nazi Germany,
Mm-hmm.
and among other things. Now, this couple of caveats here. First of all, there is a recording of this that apparently a student made and has provided to the university. We asked for a copy of that. It was rejected for a couple of reasons. One is it's UT policy that their professors have copyright control over their lectures, which I did not know until this came up. And so the professor has the copyright, and and had it beforehand. I mean, it wasn't they didn't just assert it because of this. So of course they're probably not going to allow the media to take it. And then also for student privacy reasons, student participation in classes is considered confidential, and so there would have to be, whatever recording would have to have everything that a student said redacted out of it. It's just all kinds of.
Is that
stuff.
under FERPA?
FERPA, yes, it's the federal law. What it is under the Tennessee Open or Public Records Act, a public record like a recording, which counts. If federal law prevents it from being released, then it's exempt from the Tennessee Public Records Act.
And FERPA basically protects student privacy. Right.
It's a very, very pretty strict federal law, protecting privacy. And so because FERPA protects privacy, then the Public Meetings Act or Public Records Act in Tennessee does as well. Anyway, we don't have that. UT has gave a statement kind of giving the context. That's where we got the account of kind of what the discussion was about, and they
did find some fault with the professor and the way that the material was presented.
Yeah, it was about the way that there are a couple of things. First of all, the Tennessee law does address anti-Semitic remarks and actions in higher education. There is a law and it refers to a definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that basically says you can't equate the actions of the Israeli government with the actions of the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. So, so that it apparently met that definition, and there was apparently, according to UT, a kind of a disregard for or dismissal of opposing viewpoints. People who objected to that. Apparently, it's hard to say when you can't listen to the recording, but. So there were a lot of presentation issues there. Now, apparently it does not violate the divisive concepts law that we have talked about in the past, but it certainly is enough to warrant an investigation, apparently, and they are investigating that. Now we don't know how long it will be. I don't know what the could be all kinds of avenues taken. I don't, professor has tenure, so it's not.
Sure, there are protections.
There are protections for that. There is due process. It's one of the things one of the reasons UT is being very tight-lipped about it. One of the reasons is that there is due process, and they do have to follow that. The other, of course, is with the volatile situation. There are protests all over the country at campuses. There are a lot of controversies, in universities from Ivy League schools to community colleges. So it's could be a very volatile situation. So they're trying to be very close-mouthed about that, and that's is what it is. One of the interesting things, we did reach out to the Hillel at UTK, which is the Jewish student organization. And one of the things that they pointed out was UT is the largest employer of Jewish residents in Knoxville, which I did not know either. And beforehand, but that's what they said, and they don't interfere with employers' human resources decisions, but they do hope that anti-Semitism isn't tolerated. UT has said that they will not tolerate anti-Semitism as well. So that investigation is open-ended. There's no time frame on when it will be complete, but we'll be following it to see what comes of it.
Well, and if people are wondering, like, why are we even talking about or covering something seemingly so small, a one interaction in one classroom with one professor. And it's really because this is an issue that is sort of like burning or at least simmering across the country in many different places, but especially on college campuses. And there's a lot of discussion out there about, what does anti-Semitism even actually mean? Like you were talking about one definition, there are other definitions of it. And, is just criticizing an action of the Israeli government anti-Semitic? I mean, there are some definitions, not the one that you cited, but the Anti-Defamation League, for example, basically includes says anything that is anti-Zionist, which would be, anti the existence of Israel as a state, basically, is inherently anti-Semitic. And, it's very difficult. You see just lots of, I think one thing that you see is a lot of pain and a lot of fear in multiple communities in the United States, within Jewish communities around the country, but also within Palestinian and more broadly Arab communities across the country, where everybody's kind of feeling somewhat victimized and somewhat endangered in various ways. And it's a very volatile situation. And so this is just an example of it playing out here on our own campus.
Yeah. You were mentioning the definitions of anti-Semitism. I cited one that is used in state law, which is what UT essentially needs to follow or has to follow. But there's another one that's a definition that is supported by or endorsed by the American Association of University Professors, that this would not be a violation of. You don't equate, you can criticize the Israeli government all you want, and it isn't anti-Semitic, which is, a bias against Jews as individuals or Jews as a people. So there's a distinction between Israelis and Jews that definition makes. Sure. That other definitions either don't make, or it's blurry.
Yep.
And it's a more of a national issue. And you're right, it was one class. You think that's one class. It's maybe just one student, but you know what? That's what our country is kind of about, is protecting the rights of even one person. So
yep.
So it's it does speak to some of the issues that have come up in the legislature in the past, like the divisive concepts law. And I would imagine there are probably several legislators who are very interested in what's this incident at UT, and that could have ramifications down the road when the legislature convenes in the in January.
Right. You said this isn't covered by the divisive concepts law right now, but I guess there's no reason the legislature couldn't come back and say, "Oh, and this concept also is divisive."
Yeah, there's a little thing called an amendment that they can add to that.
All right. Well, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the school board. Had a couple of interesting things this week. They had their monthly work session on Monday and voting meeting on Thursday, both very short meetings, which tip of the hat there to the school board. We're always sort of torn, I feel like, between longer meetings are more likely to maybe give us interesting things to write about, although not always. There can be long meetings that don't give you anything much to write about. But short meetings, it's kind of nice, especially these days. If you can get out of a meeting while the sun is still up in any way, I'll take that. Yeah. But even given the brevity of the meetings, within the meeting itself, on the board's agenda, they had a contract, an agreement to approve with the new charter school that is due to open here next fall, Knoxville Preparatory School, which is an all-boys school. It's going to open with just the 6th grade class, but eventually the idea is it'll grow to a 6th through 12th grade school, serving basically any boys of that grade level in Knox County who want to come will be eligible to apply there. And the school board approved the creation of that school earlier this year in a close vote, a 5-4 vote. And actually, in approving that back in April, they had to vote on it twice, because the first time they went to vote, one of the board members, one member of the 5-member Republican majority, Susan Horn, was absent, and so they deadlocked 4-4. And then when Horn came back to town, they got back together a few weeks later and went ahead and passed it 5-4. So now that they have approved it, the next step, they're required by state law to negotiate an agreement with this school, which is very much in the process of gearing up and is going to open next fall. They are required to have a contract with them. And so they were brought a proposed contract, which is almost identical to the one the school system already has with its one existing charter school, Emerald Academy. And so because of that, I think maybe people in the administration didn't anticipate that there would be a lot of pushback on it. But there were questions, and a lot of the questions really just had to do with the timing of it. They were working on this contract right up to the last minute, and school board members didn't actually end up getting a copy of the contract until just a few hours before their work session on Monday. And there were a handful of board members who also, it's fair to say, were part of the group that voted against approving the school in the first place, members of that same faction of the board, which is kind of its more, I guess, progressive, Democratic and independent faction, said, we'd like a little more time to look at this. We just got this, and we haven't approved a new charter school in 9 years. This is new territory for almost everybody on the board. We just like a month to look at it. And they voted on it on Thursday. And there were 2 board members absent at this meeting, Mike McMillan, who is also part of the Republican majority, and then Daniel Watson wasn't there. And so the vote to approve it was 4-3 in favor of approving it. The 4 Republicans on the board all voted in favor. Or it wasn't 4-3, sorry. One board member voted against it, Jennifer Owen, and then 2 others, Reverend John Butler and Catherine Bike, abstained on the vote. But the thing is that it doesn't matter how many board members are at the meeting. On the 9-member board, you need 5 votes to approve something. You can't, if you have fewer members, you can't just go with a majority of what you have. You still need 5 votes. And so with McMillan being gone as part of that 5-vote Republican majority, it functionally failed. And so the people who wanted an extra month to look at it basically got what they wanted, even though they lost the vote. And Deputy County Law Director Gary Dupler did make very clear to them that voting it down this month does not mean that they're voting it down. He was like, you still have to approve a contract. Like, you've already approved the school. You have to approve a contract. You can try to make some changes to it if you want. Take the time to study it or whatever, but it's going to come back in December, and they will vote for it there. But it's just kind of interesting. I mean, the main thing it illustrates is, how on at least some more partisan issues, how divided the school board is right now with that 5-member Republican majority. If all 5 of them are there, they can pass things. But anything that's controversial, if one of them is not there, it gets hard for them to pass things. Mm-hmm. And, you can't, in this case, McMillan was ill. I mean, you can't always control these things. But that was kind of interesting. And then at Public Forum at Thursday's meeting, there's been a phenomenon across the country over the last few years where parent groups, and especially members of this national organization called Moms for Liberty that people are probably familiar with, they've gotten a lot of press and attention, good, bad, and otherwise, in different parts of the country. But basically a very conservative, I would say culturally conservative political activist group that has aimed at, in a lot of cases, trying to take over school boards, running candidates. And there are some places where Moms for Liberty has elected, majorities of school boards. And then those boards have set about doing things like restricting certain kinds of books from school libraries and various other kind of tackling cultural issues from a very conservative standpoint, let's say, and trying to impose that on school systems. So the Knox County chapter of Moms for Liberty sort of got going a few years ago, but then seemingly went into a bit of hiatus or something. And they have reorganized, they've revitalized themselves, and this is part of a national movement that's going on. There's been a lot written about this at the national level. There are significant conservative political funders supporting Moms for Liberty at the national level. And if you look at the new Moms for Liberty Knox County page, it is a mirror image of the national page. There's a very clearly, this is being well funded and organized from kind of the national level, although the organization of local chapters is still up to local residents, obviously, but they're tapping into this big push that's going on. And there are a lot of Republican strategists out there who are being very open about the fact that they see Moms for Liberty as a valuable ally going into the 2024 election cycle. So all of this needs to be seen against a pretty explicitly political context, because that's very much the context that Moms for Liberty is operating in. It was founded by 3 current and former school board members in Florida in 2021, but one of those members just happened to be married to the chairman of the Florida Republican Party. So the ties between Moms for Liberty and the Republican Party have been very tight from the beginning. Anyway, we do have a newly organized and energized chapter here, and so for the first time at Thursday's school board meeting, we saw something that has taken place in many other school boards across the country, where members of Moms for Liberty will show up at public forum and read sexually explicit passages from books that are available in school libraries, basically by way of making the argument that this is inappropriate, this shouldn't be in our libraries, and kind of, if it makes you uncomfortable to listen to this, is this something that you want our children, whether those are middle school or high school or whatever. Most of these books they're talking about are not available in elementary school libraries. But it was interesting. Sherry Super, who is the chair of the local chapter, basically made an appeal to the board saying that the book review and challenge processes that the board has in place right now are insufficient, because while any parent can go and file a challenge against any given book, and then it gets reviewed, and then ultimately it can be appealed to the board, there's a whole process that can go on there, that it puts the onus on parents or on students to find something and bring it to the attention of their parents or whatever. And she was basically saying that we have a list of books that we know are objectionable, and this is a list that's been mostly generated at the national level by these conservative groups, and we know some of them are on the shelves, and we rather than putting it on parents to have to come in and find whether this book really is explicit and what does it say and does it bother me and whatever, they just kind of want the school system to do that for them. They want them to go through and and she kind of kept saying, we're not book banners, and I think that's a deliberate, Moms for Liberty has been called book banners lots of places by lots of people, and they know that that's not a phrase that polls well. If you look at polling across the country and polling in Tennessee as well, there's sort of bipartisan distaste and distrust of banning books. If you just ask people, are you in favor of banning books? Most Americans say no. It's kind of there's sort of I think a core American free speech value there. People don't like the sound of it. It makes you think of lots of bad chapters in our history and other people's histories. So Super said, we're not book banners. We just want you to label books, maybe sort of the way movies and CDs are labeled, maybe segregate them by age availability, maybe make it something where parents have to, instead of right now parents being able to opt out of their kids reading or studying something they object to, maybe having to have parents opt in explicitly to have their kids get access to certain things. But then she also said, or in some cases where the content is just too graphic, remove it from the schools, which was kind of, saying on the one hand, we're not book banners, but also maybe look at removing these.
Maybe we can ban some, yeah.
Right. Don't ban them all, maybe ban some. Anyway, of course, this was just done during public forum, so the school board didn't respond in any way, but Super did say that, she has submitted a list of objectionable books that she considers objectionable to school authorities, and so maybe we'll see if more comes out of it. It's kind of hard to say how much support. She did say in her statements that one board member that she has been writing to has been very responsive, and we could all speculate about who that board member may be, or we could file some public records requests to find out. So we'll let you know. But it was, I don't know whether or not this push gets the same kind of traction here that it's gotten in some other counties and places. Sort of every school district is a little bit different. But this is the first time we've seen this. And I will say that regardless of your feelings about banning books or not banning books, sitting in a school board meeting surrounded by school officials and school board members and listening to graphic depictions of, sexual abuse and violence and everything, was an interesting experience. I was talking to my wife about it, and I compared it to, I don't know if you ever had this experience when you were a teenager, maybe watching a movie with your parents and then a sex scene comes on and everybody in the room is just kind of like, oh, I kind of wish I wasn't here right now. It had a little bit of that feeling about it.
Well, what I think it's an interesting tactic, regardless of what you think of the books themselves. It's an interesting tactic because they were saying, well, if you're disturbed by this, it's bad. And of course, they're reading these explicit passages
with zero context, by the way, I should say, no sense of where does this fit in the story? Why is this even in the book? It's just these are the literal words in the book.
Yeah. But the thing about it is they're assuming that you're offended by it or you're disturbed by it. What about people who might be titillated by it? Wouldn't this tactic be promoting the public reading of these passages as a way of titillating certain people? I don't know who would be titillated by a school board meeting that has this, but
well, if it becomes a regular feature of public forum, school board videos might get a little more viewership. Than they do right now.
True. Yeah, it'd be almost like going to an audio porn site or something like that. So who knows? Anyway,
well, we will see what comes out of that. But Moms for Liberty are out there. You can find their website and contact information. If you have questions, you can contact them directly. And I'm sure we will be both talking to and about them more in the coming weeks and months. Okay. Hey, Seth, how about we take a quick break here and we will come back with our Q&A. Okay, we are to the Q&A portion of the podcast every week, or most weeks when we remember to do it. We go onto our subscriber-only Facebook page, the Compass Colloquy, which you can join if you're a subscriber, which you can become at CompassKnox.com. And we invite our readers to tell us anything beyond the obvious headlines that they'd like to hear discussed on the podcast. And Scott, this week we had a question about something you attended Thursday night, which was a city council work session where they were talking about basically state preemption of city authority. So, yeah, what all happened at that workshop?
Yeah, well, what happened was a little background first. The state legislature passed a bill that basically, this goes back to our city election stuff, that would eliminate citywide voting for district races and district city council races. If you ran it, it would be district only in the general election, right, where now it's citywide. So that was opposed by most, if not all, of city council members. They did not like it, and they especially didn't like it because the legislature made that decision and not the voters of the city of Knoxville, which they would have to change the charter in order to be able to do that. So So they've been making noise about suing the state for violating principle of home rule, which is part of the Constitution that gives cities pretty much a lot of autonomy, not complete, but a lot of autonomy in what they do. So what they did for this work session was they got people from the city of Nashville to come here, because the city of Nashville has been the target of a legislative attack, and I think even the legislators who do it would probably say this. A lot of interference, or at least taking over of a lot of functions of Nashville city government, in 4 instances in the past, the most recent legislative session earlier this year, and the city of Nashville has sued them in 4 times. And the Knoxville City Council was basically getting their expertise on it. They got Bob Cooper, who's a former state attorney general and also former Nashville law director, the current Nashville law director, Wally Dietz, and the Davidson County clerk, Brenda Wynn. They all came or Dietz appeared via Zoom. The others came and talked to council. Cooper basically gave the background on what home rule is. 1953 Constitutional Convention gave home rule to the cities in Tennessee. Prior to that, much like counties, they were basically creatures of the legislature. And so this makes them, they have their own authority given to them by the state constitution now, and it's not absolute. The state legislature still passes laws that affect cities, but they have to pass laws that affect all cities, or most cities, or basically all cities. They can't. Those are called laws of general application. They can't single cities out. And Nashville sued 4 instances earlier this year in which they felt they were singled out. One was a bill that, and they've been fairly successful. One was a bill about changing the way that the Nashville Fairgrounds Speedway changes could be made there, because there was a state law passed a long time ago that you couldn't tear down without, or renovate it without getting permission. Bristol Motor Speedway wanted to manages it. They wanted to make changes to it. They didn't know that they would get the approval of the Metro Council, so they tried to get a state law passed and did. Nashville challenged that and won in court. A 3-judge panel ruled that in Nashville's favor. The state hasn't appealed. That's moved on. Another suit involved Metro Council. Their council has 40 members. The state legislature wanted to reduce that number to 20 and passed a law to do so. The city of Nashville has filed a lawsuit and got an injunction to allow them to keep 40 members through this election. They had an election this year, as Knoxville did, and the long-term ramifications has not, but that hasn't been determined yet. So there's still a ruling left out on that.
Well, right, and because that law was not only passed to affect, I mean, it was passed directed at Nashville, but it was a law of general application because it basically said that no city council in Tennessee could have more than 20 members on it. It didn't just say Nashville can't have more than 20 members. But it's actual, because I think Nashville may be the only city in the state with more, that's a very large council of 40 members.
Yes,
so
it is. It is the only one. It
effectively singles out Nashville, but the way the law is written doesn't actually single out Nashville.
Yeah, well, and although it was, the panel initially, cut them some grace at least. And but anyway, the one was to basically a takeover of the airport authority in Nashville, and it only affected the Nashville airport, not McGee-Tyson or Memphis or Chattanooga. And court has ruled that was unconstitutional. And then they did the same with the Sports Authority, because the Sports Authority in Nashville, and the legislature says, oh, well, because we're giving, a gazillion dollars for the new Titans Stadium, which is, makes kind of what their, the contribution to the smoke.
I think that is the
stadiums.
Actual number, right? It's
Yeah.
one
One
gazillion.
Yeah, but the amount makes what they provided for the Smoky Stadium pretty minuscule.
Yeah.
But basically, it was a similar takeover of the appointments to the Sports Authority board and all, and that hasn't been decided yet. They expect a decision in January. Anyway, they were going through these things with the city and kind of what why when they would decided to bring suits and when they decided not to bring suits. One of the things that Cooper and especially Dietz emphasized to them was we want to make sure that we're on firm ground and we can win. I mean, they're not going to. Dietz basically explicitly said, we don't do this just to protest.
Right. You don't file a lawsuit against the state just because you're mad at them.
Right. And the takeaway, and one of the things that was kind of interesting is Andrew Roberto, the vice mayor, was the one who chaired the meeting for council, basically emphasized, okay, to his colleagues on Knoxville City Council, don't ask them about our situation because they can't tell you. They're here to tell us about their situation. And then, the implication was, okay, we'll take that information, we'll apply it to our situation ourselves. But one of the interesting things is, yes, they're doing this to see if it's kind of testing the waters to see, okay, would it be worthwhile for us to sue the state over the new election law here? And that's very much up in the air. One of the things about that election law is the law, what they did was they removed an exemption. State law applies generally. There was an exemption that allowed Knoxville and I think 15 or 16 other cities to hold elections the way they do now.
Right, where you have districts
or citywide
representatives who run citywide ultimately.
And so they just removed that exemption. The law itself still applies generally to all cities. So
right. There's nothing in there that says Knoxville has to do X, Y, Z.
Right.
Yeah.
So
it's actually taking out the thing that gave Knoxville an exception rather than making an exception and targeting Knoxville, which would be more obviously a violation.
Like what they did with the airport
right.
authority in Nashville.
Yeah.
I mean, that was
that was just a state takeover.
That was
one
that was a state takeover of the Nashville Airport Authority, and the law mentions the Nashville Airport, the Metro Nashville Airport Authority. So, but it was kind of interesting to hear their perspective on it. Brenda Wynn, the county clerk, she basically was there to talk about how offensive they thought all this was. She didn't really. It was less about her official duties and more about because she's been there for so long. She was around when Metro Davidson County formed.
Wow. In
the early '60s. So but it was basically a learning experience. They didn't, council made no decisions about what they're going to do. I think it's iffy if they move forward. They will have to make a decision soon about whether to move forward and sue.
Right. They either have to challenge it or they have to change their existing law.
They either have to change it and they'd have to change the charter because it was the election laws laid out in the charter in the city, and to change the charter it has to get on the ballot next year. So and of course, it's even now. They could just not do anything, I guess. And as long as they follow the state law, the charter can say what it wants, but you generally like to have the charter reconciled with what you actually do. So that'll, there has been no decision made. It's hard to see where they could make the same argument that Nashville made in the airport authority case on this case.
Right.
Not only because it just removes an exemption rather than it establishes a new law, but also the other cities that are involved. Now, there is a precedent that Cooper talked about that, the legislature can't just add one other city to it and make it kosher. They've got to, it's got to really be a general application law, and this law does apply. The exemption applied to 16 cities, so at least, and so it's certainly the door is still open there, and right. But the decision, as mentioned, has to get done pretty soon.
Well, and it's just another illustration of something we've talked about before, and it's a long-running trend of this tension between our Republican supermajority in the legislature and our, as we were talking about earlier, increasingly progressive urban areas, the four big cities in Tennessee that we talk about have all trended in general more progressive, more blue over the last few decades as the state has solidified overall, and the legislature, especially with the way the legislative districts are drawn, has been more and more Republican and conservative. And, it's a really interesting dynamic that we see across the South and really in all of the red states, where the bluest areas of all of the red states are their cities, and there's lots of reasons for that I think most people are familiar with. Cities tend to be more diverse. They attract more, I don't know the nice way to say it, more liberal-minded people, I guess, tend to be attracted to kind of like the dynamism and so forth of urban areas.
Well, a lot of jobs that require education, require liberal thought, are located in cities.
And also, of course, you get a lot more racial diversity in cities. But those cities also tend to be the economic centers of those red states. And it's absolutely true in Tennessee. I mean, Nashville by itself is really an economic engine of the state, and its surrounding counties are part of that too. And of course, the surrounding counties around Nashville are mostly quite Republican. But those counties really rely on Nashville, on the economic powerhouse and engine that is Nashville. Knoxville, Chattanooga, Memphis to a lesser degree, because Memphis has a lot of poverty. Memphis has, kind of its own history, but still, it's a major economic center of the state. And, one thing you've seen, and you're talking about it here with Nashville, but this happened in other states too, is a tendency for some of these Republican legislatures to kind of go in and try to cherry pick the parts of the cities that they like. So like in Mississippi, Jackson, of course, is the capital and is also so it's where the state government is based, but it's also the most democratic city. It's a majority black city in Mississippi. And one thing the legislature started to do there is they had a proposal this past year, I'm not sure of the current status of it, but to create a separate state police force that was going to have law enforcement jurisdiction over sort of a core part of the middle of Jackson. So imagine the Tennessee legislature just kind of saying, oh, and we're also going to just deploy our own police, for the 10 blocks around the Capitol or whatever, and kind of take that away from Metro Nashville. That would be very controversial. The airport authority, is an example of something kind of like that. And there was a proposal last year for the state to take over governing liquor licenses on, the Broadway corridor there in Nashville, the tourism corridor, which really came out of all the fights over pandemic restrictions, and a lot of the people who operated some of those places were mad at the way the city regulated them. And, I think that it can be difficult for a lot of these Republican legislators to feel like, on the one hand, they have kind of all the power in the state, except in the actual most populous, most economic, dynamic parts of the state, where there's all these dang liberals who have all of this power. Yeah,
I mean, it even goes back structurally, because counties are political subdivisions of the state. Cities are not. Cities are kind of independent. I mean, that's the whole point of being a home rule city, is having some independence. It isn't just a place where a network of roads is built up around a crossroads and lots of people live there, and it is an independent organization.
And voluntary. I mean, I think one thing people sometimes lose sight of, cities are voluntary organizations. Yeah. Counties are established by the state constitution. Like, county governments have to exist.
Yes.
No city in the state has to exist. The Constitution provides pathways for them to exist. Right. But every city in the state was, as was Knoxville, actually Knoxville was founded before the state was even founded. But every city in the state was founded by people who live there coming together, voting to organize as a municipality. It's a voluntary association. Everything about the existence of cities is voluntary and is supported by the people who live there. Cities could also choose to disincorporate if they want to. But that also has to be done by the people who live there. The state cannot, under current state law anyway, the state can't just come in and disincorporate a city and say, sorry, Knoxville, we don't like who you voted for in your city council election.
And it's funny that you mentioned that, because Cooper he talked ancient history as well. And before Home Rule came in, this legislature dissolved the Nashville charter, I believe it was 3 times, he said, and basically just said, you got to start over. They just dissolved the city and reconstituted it. So,
well, and who knows, there could always be a proposal in the legislature to revisit that question of, whether the state could assert more authority there. And that would have to be a constitutional thing.
Yep. And so it's not likely that's
it would be a heavy lift, let's say. All right. Well, hopefully that provides some clarity and context for what that meeting was all about. Let's look ahead to next week. We have a couple of meetings coming up. County Commission will hold its monthly work session this Monday, the 13th, at 5 p.m. in the main assembly room of the City County Building. This is a week earlier than that meeting would usually be held, because they moved up their meeting schedule to get everything done before the Thanksgiving holiday. A couple of interesting things on the agenda, so they will be talking about these at this week's work session and then voting on them the next week. Big one is the ambulance contract, the new ambulance contract that we have talked about here in some detail. The recommendation is to grant a new contract to American Medical Response, the existing ambulance provider in the county, along with a $2.1 million a year payment from the county to help make that contract viable for the private company. So that'll be on the agenda. And then there's also a new agreement on the agenda, which will also be coming, I think, to City Council sometime in the near future, where both the county and the city are turning over their animal control operations. Right now, both the Knox County Sheriff's Office and Knoxville Police Department have their own divisions of animal control that respond to animal calls across the city and county. And both of those law enforcement organizations would like to get out of the, rabid dog wrangling or whatever, the various kinds of calls they get. And so there's an agreement with Young Williams Animal Center, which of course already provides, they already are the shelter provider for both the city and county for stray animals and so forth. And they would also, under this contract, actually be taking over the animal control operation. And so if you call somebody to respond, it would actually be people from Young Williams rather than from the law enforcement agencies. So that contract is on the commission agenda as well. And then City Council is meeting Tuesday.
Yes, City Council is meeting Tuesday. And if you thought that we would be able to get through an episode without talking a lot about the housing shortage, you are sadly mistaken, because City Council has 3 measures they're going to take up on Tuesday about housing. One is and we mentioned this before, that the mayor had hinted, Mayor Kincannon had hinted that they were going to make some changes to the what's called naturally occurring affordable housing, which is basically old apartment buildings. That's generally considered the kind of the untapped or unrecognized majority of the affordable housing in the city. Are these unsubsidized units? They're just apartment units out there that are old, tend to be older, and the rents are lower, and so and one of the impetuses behind this was what happened with Tanglewood Apartments, which is now called the Rand Artillery, where they kind of did some minor renovations to the property, and then doubled the rent, and a lot of people had to leave, and that sparked quite a bit of outrage. There's been a tenants union formed from the core group, or the former residents or current residents in some cases of that apartment complex. And what the goal of this proposal is to prevent the loss of what we already have as affordable housing. About half the housing units in the city are 50 years old, so it's quite a substantial number of units that we're talking about. Of course, some of that includes single family houses as well as apartments. But what this proposal would be the authorization from council to use payment in lieu of tax agreements, the Affordable Housing Fund, and other city incentives and programs to support the types of developments, the naturally occurring affordable housing, which is called NOAA, the acronym is. What the proposal doesn't go into detail, but one of the things they can theoretically do if this goes through is set up a program where owners of these apartment complexes can get some have their taxes frozen, payment in lieu of tax agreement, have their taxes frozen if they renovate and keep the it helps pay for the renovation project and helps keep the rents lower. And that's kind of a because you can't do rent control, it's kind of an incentive to get these developers to control the rents themselves,
right, while modernizing
their facilities. Anyway, and also there's one part of this proposal that talks about using these incentives along the commercial corridors where there are especially areas where there are empty larger big box buildings or grocery stores that have moved on and such, and so there are areas, and it basically is letting developers and property owners know that, hey, these types of incentives that we've used to revitalize downtown can be used along the corridors as well. So if you own property along Chapman Highway or along Clinton Highway and you want to turn it into a mixed use, you want to put in a mixed use development where you've got residential and commercial in the same building, we've got the incentives for you. So, but they're going to be considering that. There are two other proposals though. These came courtesy of Councilman Tommy Smith and Councilwoman Seema Singh. One would be, we've talked about the missing middle housing for a long time. The mayor's proposal has kind of languished. It didn't pass through planning commission to get to council itself. So it's still down at that level, and it would promote this middle housing, duplexes, triplexes, small apartment complexes in the traditional neighborhood zones inside the I-640 Beltway, essentially the older neighborhoods around the downtown core. In all the residential, the proposal now is all the residential zones except RN1, which is kind of the larger lots, single family homes. For the most part, you really can't. You can build duplexes on there if you get the use approved, special use, and then the others you can't build there at all. So Smith and Singh were proposing that they add that to the mix. So that's fairly straightforward. The other was kind of an interesting proposal. It has to do with short-term rentals, and currently there are two types of short-term rental permits you can get. One is for residential areas. You have to live in your residence if you in a residential zone, and then you can rent it out as a short-term rental. Then there's areas that aren't residential, based primarily commercial areas, where you can have more than one short-term rental.
And this is like downtown especially.
Downtown especially, but it's any zone really that's just not residential.
Right.
Downtown happens to be where most of this is concentrated. But it even allows people who rent apartments downtown, say, or rent apartments on Cumberland Avenue, say, people who rent can then sublease their apartments out as short-term rentals with the landlord's permission. And what this proposal would do would expand that and allow those in residential areas to do the same thing. Whereas if you rent a house in a residential area, you can rent it out as a short-term rental with the permission of your landlord.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they have to. And that mechanism to get permission from landlords is already in place.
So it'd kind of be treating renters the way the current law treats homeowners. Like, if you live, somebody still has to live there. An apartment in a residential neighborhood couldn't be used as a full-time Airbnb.
Right.
But if you rent an apartment and you want to put it up on Airbnb or VRBO or whatever, and have people come and stay there a couple weekends a month, and you'll go stay at, your significant other's place or whatever. Like it would make that possible. Yeah,
it would make that possible. I spoke with Councilman Smith, who was is co-sponsor of this the other day, and he was saying that one of the things is or a couple of things. One is you've got all these rents going. I mean, rents are really through the roof in Knox County. This gives renters, a way to make a little money on the side to help pay that extra rent, and
if they have somewhere else to stay while they're renting out.
Well,
there. Or if they just don't mind someone sleeping on their couch, I guess.
Yeah, whatever their arrangement is, that's up to them. Yeah. But I mean, it would give somebody the opportunity who rents to make a little extra money, just like a homeowner. And because really, if you're a homeowner and you rent out as an Airbnb, you have to find another place to live too. I mean,
or you can
stay over the weekend.
Set up a separate. I mean, what private homeowners can do is set up an apartment in their basement or their attic or the garage or whatever, as long as they do actually live on site.
Yeah, but anyway, this would, and also it puts them on a level playing field with people who rent in downtown or other areas where they can take advantage of this program anyway. So, and all of it would have to, get permission from the landlord and all that. So, that is out there. It's one of those small things. It's not like everyone who rents in the city of Knoxville would automatically start turning around and renting out their apartments as Airbnbs, because there's a lot to it. is not.
But I mean, you think about it, so like Fort Sanders is full of apartments, and boy, howdy, would there be a market for those some weekends a year.
Yeah, and in lots of places, really. I mean, if you want to, and especially with UT, because you can really charge a lot of money. But you've got Mechanicsville, which thanks to Bentley Marlowe now has a lot of renovated houses over there. You got Sequoia Hills. There are houses you rent in Sequoia Hills, and you could turn around and make a good chunk. That's real convenient. South Knoxville as well, because it's very convenient to UT. East Knoxville is very convenient to UT. So, and all those areas have rental houses in residential zones where people could feasibly set up. I've lived in plenty of rental houses in my day that I could have divided up to have a short-term rental if I'd been creative enough to actually and entrepreneurial enough to think about it. But it's one little thing. I don't know that. I don't have a good gauge. I haven't talked to enough council members to know if that's got a whole lot of support moving forward. I think there's a lot,
or if some neighborhood groups or somebody else might
in
opposition to it.
Well, I'm sure that there will be some opposition to it, because there's always opposition from some neighborhood groups, or at least people within neighborhoods, to short-term rentals in residential areas. I mean, that's the whole reason we have these regulations, is because there were people that were upset about it. The RN1 addition to the missing middle proposal is a little less controversial, primarily because a lot of the planning commissioners, when they initially considered this, wondered why RN1 wasn't considered along with RN2, 3, 4, and 5. So, and then the mayor's proposal on existing incentives for invest in existing housing, I think is one that will probably easily get widespread support on council, because it's a way to encourage investment in areas of our city where you might not otherwise get investment.
Right. All right. Well, we will be back next week to talk about those things and anything else that happens in the interim. Thanks always to Lord Seth Barber behind the boards here at Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by Will Wright, and we'll talk to you next week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.